Hello and welcome to the EMS Handoff Podcast. This is David, along with my co-host Eric McCullough and Bradley Dean. We are your source for all things EMS. So we're coming together tonight. A little bit of hiatus over the last week and a half of schedules. Just sometimes the best laid plans, and I'm taking credit on this one because I have been all over the place in the last little bit. So we did finally get the band back together and coming on with the next episode. So before we get started, we got to do the adulting thing, right? So how's the weather, Eric?
Oh, my weather's great. Yeah, I do have a problem though. This time change. I think we should all blame it on the time change. Like I was telling Bradley before I got on, I was literally just laying there and I just was out because it's been dark for 6 hours, it feels like. So that has been we need to get away. We need to get away from this daylight savings time.
Funny story, and I'm actually trying to pull it up right now, but I saw something about legislation being introduced for daylight savings time.
Oh, that would be amazing.
Federal legislation and say we're trying to change. You know, it's kind of funny because there's a few states that actually don't recognize it already. So let alone anything else. And then the reference that I saw, somebody actually did a study, and it does affect individuals more than just the time itself. So it's quite interesting. Let's see. I think some of this is local, but you never know. So, Brad, did you catch up on that extra hour of sleep or?
No, I have. I can't figure out and I know Bradley's over there because he's been working, and don't get me wrong, I've worked a few shifts, but I haven't worked like he's worked. But the kids are waking up at 5 o'clock in the morning, which is a real bummer. And they're out by 7:30, 8 o'clock. They're just barely keeping their eyes open. I look over, my 7-year-old boy puts himself to sleep. So it's just throwing everybody off. I wish all the politicians could just come together for this one thing. I think we all want it, is just to get rid of the daylight savings time.
Well, it's funny. Last week, driving to work, and it's still dark outside, and then driving this week, and it's bright as can be.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. But then you turn around, and it's like driving home. Last week there was sun, and this week there's not. Or vice versa. Shoot, I don't even know anymore. So. Bradley Dean, you are over there working today. So, how's life treating you over in North Carolina?
Well, I mean, life's great. I mean, yes, I've been working, but so I took a little bit of time to do some research during our little hiatus here, and I always wondered, why do we always talk about the weather? So I did a little bit of research, and whether it's with you guys or somebody else. Anytime you go in somewhere, people talk about the weather because it's kind of a code that that's helped us evolve to get over some social inhibitions and just start conversations. So I thought I'd do a little bit of research to find out why we always do that.
Well, I started doing it now mainly because Eric,
I was complaining about it.
So, all we do is talk about the weather. It's
it's true. It's like a bunch of old guys at Cracker Barrel or Waffle House or something. I'm from Middle Tennessee. I don't know if you guys got all that where you're from, Bradley.
Oh my goodness! Yeah. Are you really thinking that we don't have Cracker Barrel and the Waffle House?
I know that Cracker Barrel. Yeah.
I do know that once you go west of the Mississippi, you cannot get grits at Cracker Barrel unless you ask for them specifically.
Yeah, really? I don't think I'd want them if they don't readily have them available to you. Because it feels like it would be like bitter grits. God, I got to give this dude some grits.
We have completely thrown this one way off. But so let's go ahead and gather ourselves back together. And before we get on to this week's topic, we want to thank our podcast sponsor, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. Jim's has been a great partner to the EMS Handoff podcast since we have come back. And we join a great cast of podcasters on their EMS Today podcast. Make sure to go by gyms.com. Take a look at all of their industry-leading news. They're talking about and staying on top of a lot of different issues that are affecting EMS these days. You can also check out all of our previous episodes, as well as our fellow podcasters. And you all know what? This is interesting. We have now been over 1 year back together. So quite a long year. It's been fun. We've had tons of growth in this podcast. So make sure to go by, subscribe, rate, and review on all of their platforms. We also want to give a shout out to our merchandise apparel line from the Pursuit Company. The Pursuit Company partnered with us to provide our clothing and our merchandise line. You can go by thepursuitco.com and get the EMS Handoff line, from the Black Subdue that I got on tonight to our Keep Back podcast line. And they also go to support Love 147 to help end human trafficking. So make sure to go by the Pursuit Co. and pick up some of your own EMS Handoff merchandise. Bradley Dean, been a topic in the media for the last little bit, and, especially when it's affecting EMS. So let's go ahead and kick off this conversation and see where it takes us.
Well, in the media a couple of weeks ago, I was reading where first responders have now been charged because they gave ketamine to somebody. So a widow is suing a South Carolina county for EMS providers for negligence because she says that the EMS worker's actions when administering ketamine to her husband amounted to an unlawful, unjustified, and unreasonable use of force. Now, this case comes right on the heels of one in Colorado, along with lots of things with ketamine. So if you have fast forwarded through the first 10 minutes of us talking about the weather to get to ketamine, this has become a pretty hot topic. And I'm going to sum everything up at the beginning, but we're going to continue talking about it. Is ketamine is a great drug and a great medication to be used on patients if given by the right provider to the right patient at the right time. You know, all the things that we talk about. The problem is we tend to select it poorly because we have a solution looking for a problem.
And I think you kind of hit the nail right on the head. And, you know, this really relatively short episode, except for our conversation about the weather, in the fact that, you know, as we take a look at our advanced life support skills, we have a lot of tools, and we've talked about it on this podcast, as well as when we were still doing the tidbits before. You know, even airway management techniques such as intubation, you know, things that we use at the wrong point in time or use them properly are going to end up creating a significant issue. And if we're not prepared for those, then the outcome is somebody's life. And I think that's what we're seeing here with the ketamine as well. But, you know, what I find funny is, let me correct, that's not a really good way to say it. What I find interesting is that when we're looking at a lot of these cases, it's not ketamine being used for pain management. It's ketamine being used in some sort of chemical sedation. And I think that's where we get into that. So when we talk about ketamine for pain management, you know, it's there and we utilize it. It's only really when we turn the page and use it for chemical sedation.
Yeah. And if you look at some of the research, most of the problem comes when it's used for chemical sedation. But there are some very tight parameters that we probably should really be looking at when we use it for chemical sedation for the patients who are really extremely agitated. And I would say agitated delirium or excited delirium are the cases that we really need to be using it in. Not because a patient is or an individual is uncooperative or demonstrating behavior that is out of the norm, because if they have ingested alcohol or other intoxicants that are not uppers like cocaine, then all we're doing is we're adding to the other pharmacology they've already got on board that's causing more sedation. And causing the issues that we're seeing.
So I think part of the conversation that we need to expand before we go too deep in here, let's first talk about excited delirium and the need for the behavioral side as far as chemical sedation. So let's talk about those patients quickly, and then we'll transfer back to the volume. So what are you seeing with these patients, and what is excited delirium, and why is ketamine the drug of choice when we're looking at those patients?
Well, and when you look at excited delirium or agitated delirium, these patients are hyper agitated. They have strength, beyond that of what normal humans would have. They are hyperdynamic, hyperthermic, and if they are not, sweating, even if it's freezing cold outside, it's probably not something that we need to treat with ketamine. We have other things such as benzos and Haldol. So excited delirium itself is fatal. And we've got to do something to stop that patient from going further down that path of rhabdomyolysis to where they're going to actually have cellular destruction because they're hyperthermic. And if we're going to treat a patient for excited delirium with ketamine, they should follow that up with monitoring the airway. They should follow it up with IV fluids, because we've got to get those patients cooled off and rehydrated.
So I think you make a very valid point there that we have, with every medication, so we have our generalized dosing for that, and we kind of go for that minimum, maximum dosing, but we want a response to that medication. And so as we give, we have to be prepared for everything, because ketamine, can cause respiratory arrest, respiratory depression or arrest, depending on how much you're going to administer. And then obviously beyond that, without quick correction, we end up in cardiac arrest. So in this case, we're administering maybe a little bit too much, or the patient just has a reaction to the medication. And so we have to go basically in our checklist to say, okay, this is beyond what we wanted. How do I reverse? How do I manage? Because before I get into some of the reversal agents, I need to take and manage that airway appropriately. I need to take and manage the circulation appropriately. Right?
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that we have to do, with these patients. And the first thing is we need to point everything back to recognizing the condition before we even get all the way into, a lot of the treatment. There was an article that was put out. I can't remember the exact date, but I want to say it was somewhere around 2011. Dr. Wesley put out an article, I think it was on GEMS, and, he goes through the whole thing of excited delirium. And I really think that they need to reprint the article and put it in there, because he goes through all the pathophysiology and the treatment of it. But the problem is most people probably have not looked at it or paid attention to it.
So let's go to the opposite side.
And I just found it.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I just found it because it finally just popped up. It was 2011. So I did find it.
Okay. Well, we'll include that in the show notes as well. So let's kind of go to the other side. So, as you were doing the research for this episode and kind of talking about some of the different cases that we saw here, there's many different cases recently in the media, going back from this one in South Carolina from 2019, the cases in Colorado and stuff like that. So one of the things that we do have to take a look at in our care is that, we need to have the tools that are available. And what we're seeing, especially in Colorado, is now that case has been adjudicated or going through the system, and seeing the adverse actions, we're seeing the pendulum swing to the opposite side, and several localities and even the state looking to ban ketamine use in pre-hospital care altogether. And that pendulum may, as you mentioned earlier, ketamine is an excellent pharmacologic intervention for pre-hospital use, and when used appropriately, does an extremely good job. So how do we, obviously, in treating our patients, we want to make sure and do the best, but to me, this is an education or advocacy issue. Said, yeah, we have a bad situation. We need to recognize and see that, that bad situation did occur, and we want to use it appropriately. So please don't take this medication away from us, right?
Right. I mean, to me, if you turn around and take, ketamine away from EMS providers, that is no different than turning around and having a police-involved shooting with an individual that posed a threat that, as it goes through and is adjudicated, that taking firearms away from law enforcement officers. If an officer does something wrong, we need to take care of that particular problem. But we don't need to take firearms away from every police officer.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've listened to enough like military podcasts and like Jocko podcasts and stuff where that exact thing is, the philosophy is, this one person did something bad with it, therefore everyone must be punished, or we need to scrutinize and analyze. What you're describing, David, to me is more of a training problem too. Because I mean, like you were saying before we started this, like they give us these nice tools and stuff, and yeah, you go through one little in service on like a thump or a new defibrillator and things like that. But if they put a new medication on board, they basically just insert a new piece of paper in with your protocols, and like, okay, that's your new drug now. Granted, as a professional provider, we should all be going through that to make sure that we know what to use it for and why to use it, but we also need to be going through competencies to establish it, because ketamine is not like any other drug that we give. Most of the other drugs, I think we could all argue this, is most of the other drugs in the ambulance is largely innocuous in the sense of like, okay, so you're going to give some Zofran to somebody, give some albuterol. Most of the drugs in our drug kit are not going to be so overwhelmingly detrimental and have such side effects it leads to negative patient outcomes. This is one medication where if we get the decision incorrect and we get the dosing incorrect, because you're looking at what I call a halo event, a high acuity, low occurrence event, excited delirium, agitated delirium. These are not events that you're going to see all the time. So the one time that you do see it, if you have not been training yourself properly, not educating yourself properly, you're going to have a tendency of either underdosing them or overdosing them. And that's why I personally have not really used a lot of ketamine, even though we've had access to it. I've never been in a situation where I was like, I need ketamine for this guy. I've been able to thankfully use other strategies. Or other strategies besides ketamine. So I thought I saw it more as a training problem when it came to that than it is anything else. And instead of scrutinizing the training and the competency behind it, they're just like, no, just get rid of ketamine. It must be a bad thing, even though they never looked at any other data.
I mean, it's interesting when you take a look at ketamine use and you're bringing up the military. Ketamine lollipops are readily given. You got somebody in pain, hand this thing over, and no matter how quickly they suck on the lollipop, they never really overdose on that. So, it's like, here, have another one. You're in a little bit of pain, keep going. So, we have seen that in the pre-hospital setting, it can definitely be used very effectively. And again, when it comes down to something like that, obviously the lollipops are more of a controlled release because of what it's actually saturated in. But that is where it exists. And as we were talking about before we got started, when we take a look at this, it's kind of one of those things when something is new that is out there, the incidence of it being utilized increases dramatically. So, my reference was with RSI, the new service starts with RSI, and all of a sudden they have 32 patients in a reporting period that have been RSI'd when previously or historically they've done like 32 intubations in a year. And we see that grow because it's something new, it's something cool. And with ketamine, it's definitely something that's there. And with the dissociative properties, there's a lot of stuff that we have the capability to do with it. But the problem is when and how, because again, in the conversation we're having right now, we're talking more specifically to those in the excited delirium or, the need for chemical sedation versus that pain management. So the idea is, hey, I've got this person, as Bradley was mentioning, it's hyperthermic, hyper agitated, has superhuman strength. And so it's like, hey, I need to give a lot. And because of the emotions in that environment, you're not prepared if it goes too far.
You made a good point there. Sometimes we get sucked in emotionally because either we're involved with, the patient fighting against us, or now we see law enforcement fighting with the individual. And it's not the case. The individual is probably just uncooperative and, for whatever reason. But let's go back to the other part of this of, should it be taken away from everybody? So we've got these cases, the cases in Colorado, the cases in South Carolina, as well as some others. Now, I'm going to go ahead and say this. I am not a lawyer, but we need to look at, some things. And I made a few notes that, based on what's happening here is they're trying to criminalize acts of, what they're claiming is medical malpractice and making a deviation from EMS protocols. So first of all, even if it's true that they, fail to make incorrect determination of excited delirium in the cases that we're looking at, it would be really difficult for the prosecution to prove that their failure rose to the level of intent or culpability or even criminal negligence, because there are three general things that we got to look at. So negligence is basic medical malpractice, which is an unintentional act. So if they were negligent, as claimed in the case from this widow, that's an unintentional act. So then they have to prove gross negligence. So there's lots of things there that have to be proven for gross negligence. And with that, that's a civil matter. It's going to be really hard to criminalize that. And then you have to look at intent. Intent is the top end of the continuum when we look at this, that requires proof that the defendant or the paramedics in these cases willfully and purposefully committed an act in violation of the law. I can assure you that no paramedic woke up that morning in any of these cases and said, I'm going to go out here today and I'm going to give ketamine and screw somebody's day up. So we've got to look at this. And I know we live in such a litigious society. Don't be afraid to take care of patients because of these lawsuits. At the same time, administrators have to look at something, which we'll talk about. We'll come back to the training piece of it in just a minute. But in these cases, the prosecution is trying to break new ground by criminalizing these cases. And what we've seen is a cascading effect with this because of what happened in Colorado, what's happened in South Carolina, what's happened in other places. And, it's a great medication for the intended purpose.
Well, and I think there's also a conversation piece here, simply discussing how we discuss ketamine being administered. So a situation relatively close in which a law enforcement officer, I actually got a phone call, and I'm not a big individual to take expert cases, but the individual started going through the conversation that was going on, and ultimately the law enforcement officer told paramedic that I need you to put him under. And there was no medical need, there was just back talking ultimately, and so they put him in. They used ketamine and put him under. It's one of those things that, how we get to that point. And again, if you kind of take a look at the South Carolina case, it makes mention that, there was little to no assessment of the patient. They administered the medication at the maximum dose, and again, without that assessment, and went into it. And, it's something that I hear quite frequently from providers as well. They talk about sending them down the K-hole. And, it's one of those things, and, even some of the research materials that talk about that. And again, that's that dissociative property that ketamine does have. And, it's colloquially called that. But if we're using that in and around patients' families, that kind of exacerbates their concern whenever something adverse does happen.
Yeah, I think like when you're looking at I get that everybody's litigious, and we should absolutely be cognizant of that. But when you do have the way that we discuss it in amongst ourselves, and the way that we're kind of flippant about it, especially a medication that we don't use that often. So, I mean, statistically, it's just not there. We just don't. It'd be one thing if we were a little bit more nuanced in medications that we give all the time, breathing treatments, maybe even antiarrhythmics or things like that. Man, when you talk about medics discussing, putting patients into K-holes and stuff, I think it's more like and I might be wrong, and I might get flogged for this on social media, and that's fine. But when we chest beat about, I put that patient in K-holes, and we just gave him some ketamine and stuff. It's like, man, physicians, when they make these decisions in the clinical environment, it's because they've had residencies. It's because they've been through plenty of years where they've had at least a chief resident. They've had controlled opportunities for years to develop a knack for practicing medicine. And a lot of times, since we do not get that, we've already established most of the time we get, hey, there's a new drug, here's the concentration, go through this online module, here's the piece of paper, sign it, make sure you get through the module, and then, this is what we're going to do from here on out. And that's fine, but it still can breed some really inconsistency, especially if, we do have this weird gray area, because now we're not just talking about medicine, now we're talking about constitutional rights. Like putting someone under, man, that's a strong verbiage for somebody. It's like, you better have a very good reason, because that kind of goes back to the whole excited delirium, agitated delirium state. We have to be really good about recognizing it. And I'll be honest, I don't know how well I could obviously recognize somebody that is being harmful to themselves and just being ridiculous, but I don't know at what point we decide we are ready to use ketamine, instead of it just being the automatic, oh, nope, if I had a blow dart gun, I would use ketamine in that sucker, So I'm just saying, I think we got to be really careful, like you said, around the verbiage, our attitudes around it, because if we become a little bit too blasé about it, then this is what creates error and ultimately makes it not look like we're professional about our business.
Well, I think one of the points that you make there is got to be key in the fact that there are individuals with excited delirium or agitated delirium that are still lucid, and they have the ability to answer all of your questions and make decisions. And so, we've got to present in that case the need that we have to make the decisions on the patient's behalf. And in this instance, based on, now granted, the case that we're looking at here in South Carolina, it's being written from the point of view of the family. But in here, the individual's asking to talk to somebody. So there's conversation about rational thought being there. And so for us making a medical decision that the patient doesn't agree with, we're technically doing so without consent. And again, going to Bradley's point, we're not lawyers. We don't have Wes with us here tonight, or Doug. So again, we don't have any of any of that. But once we start to make that consent decision on our own, and we don't have a legal right to do so, then ultimately there's concern of assault and battery.
Yeah, and I really don't think that the legal argument and the legal discussion really comes up enough in our training. Like every single time we do some type of training piece, we need to discuss, even if it's for a brief 5-minute, 2-minute component, the legal implications of it, either the state law or the federal law or something that protects the patient. Because, I mean, ultimately, if Wes were here, he would say, it depends, because he always says it depends. Because it's not black and white, and that's the problem. Like you said, we have to draw up really good. So our documentation has to be on point. Our assessment skills have to be on point. And our knowledge about the legal implications of this has to be on point, because we can't be violating people's constitutional rights. And I'm sorry, but everybody does deserve the right to know what drug they're getting. Again, kind of the blasé attitude or the passive attitude of going into, oh, I just, give them a drug without really educating on them. Sometimes we don't have the opportunity to do that. I completely get it. But you're right. If they are completely aware and oriented and cognitive and they are functioning well enough, they deserve the right to know what you're giving them and why they're getting it. Now, of course, if they're truly in excited delirium and they're not really with it, then yeah, that's a completely separate discussion. But yeah, we do need to have more of those discussions where the legal implications are part of the training and not just like separate. It's like, oh yeah, by the way, that's important, but not as important.
Yeah. So I wanted to run some numbers, and that's what I was sitting here doing. So you were talking about physicians going through residency and having the knowledge and the background to pull from because of their environment versus EMS. So if you take a physician, emergency medicine physician, that's just out of residency. So let's look at this. So for 4 years, he's been in an ED. We're going to say that there's a minimum of 180 shifts a year for him. He's going to see roughly 20 patients a day. That's over 14,000 patients before they're out on their own and still have others that they can probably turn to. If you take a paramedic student that works 180 shifts, which they don't have to do, by the way, that sees 8 patients a day, that's 1,400 patients before they're out on their own. There is a huge disparity between the two. And I really don't think that, that paramedic that is cut loose and put out on their own that has that 1,400 patient background would have had the chance or the opportunity to find or see an excited delirium patient. So we've got to spend more time in training and doing that. Or when we take a medication and we put it on a truck, we can't say, hey, here's a memo, here's what it does, here's who you use it on. Put it on the truck and be done with it.
So that's actually where you started to get to where I was going next, because as we were talking about earlier, this is a training component. So, as we look at this, what is the minimum requirement? So Bradley, I'm assuming your all service has ketamine.
We do.
How long has that been around for you all?
So we have had ketamine for the last, I can look back, but I want to say the last 4 years.
Okay. So let's do this. Eric decides to go out and start an ambulance service. He starts the ambulance service. It's out. They've got multiple trucks on the road, ALS service, and he's operating in McCulloughville. And his medical director is proactive and says, hey, let's do ketamine. Ketamine's great. We can utilize it for pain management. We can use it for sedation. We can use it part of our RSI protocol. You can do it all. I've written the protocols. It's approved by the state. We're good to go. What is the minimum training requirement to make that a reality?
Well, I mean, I would say that varies. So when we did it, I can tell you we did roughly a 2.5 to 3 hour review session that involved conditions that it should be used with, reviewing those conditions, the dosage and medication with that. We then did some hands-on review and training for the drug-assisted intubation. And at the same time, the hands-on also talked about excited delirium and who should and shouldn't get it at that point. And we still had trouble with it.
So and that's what I'm saying is you're basically making a day out of an 8-hour training day plus a little bit. And then, so even in your crunching of numbers, yes, we have the background of understanding pharmacokinetics and dynamics and how different medications work. But, when we really take a look at ketamine specifically, it's kind of like when we talk about succinylcholine or ROC or VEC or, some of the other medications, it's not that we just need to know that we can use it and that its dose is, whatever we're going to say, 0.01 milligrams per kilogram or whatever our dosing is for a specific medication. It's that we got to know what it acts on, how it acts on, and if something happens, how to get out of however it is acted on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that we do that, and there are some key things that administrators need to look at, as well as medical directors. And one, you got to look at your agitated patient protocol review. There's a difference between that agitated patient and the uncooperative patient, which we've talked about. We often experience patients that are having behavioral emergencies. Just because it's a behavioral emergency does not equate the use of ketamine. And I think that's part of the problem we run into. So just because it's a behavioral emergency does not equate to the use of ketamine. So there are benzos, there are buprenorphines that we can use for those patients. The second thing that we've got to look at is we've got to train all personnel, not just the paramedics and the personnel that are going to be delivering that medication. If you've got BLS providers that work in a system that provides ALS, while they can't necessarily administer those medications, they should be aware of where those medications are and what those medications do, because they are going to be part of the treatment plan. Just like in a hospital, CNAs or respiratory therapists are not going to be taking care and doing certain things, but they've got to be familiar with what the nurse or what the physician is going to be doing. So train all of your personnel in that. So look at, the patient assessment so they can formulate a treatment plan. What's their thought process in doing that? Make sure your personnel know the ketamine indications, dose calculations, administration routes. And when I say dose calculations, in the past, I've always been, in favor of, having cards or figure those. And see, Eric's holding his up. He's got his ketamine card right there. Or, if we look at it, standard dosing ranges, if it's you that's having that excited delirium, I'm going to pop you with 400 milligrams of ketamine. I'm not going to sit here and calculate your weight. If you go back to what they want to do in Colorado, they've got to have an accurate weight for the patient before they give it. If you're fighting an excited delirium, I can't pick you up and put you on a set of scales. I don't carry those on the ambulance.
No. In fact, it's hard to see this, obviously, but mine, because I'm not used to giving ketamine, and at 2:00 in the morning, you don't want me, carnival barking your weight. So what I did, I literally drew the syringe, so I know what syringe I need to pick up. I even have estimated weights on the side. And then I even have where kind of based on the weight where I draw up on that syringe based on these parameters and these doses. It's a good task offloader for me because I don't give this drug that often, and I can't trust myself with this drug, and I can't trust myself with the protocols. Literally, if anybody wants to do this, by the way, it's literally just shipping tape, note cards, and a free carabiner from the college I used to work at. I mean, I have a bunch of stuff on here. But yeah.
And and I even want to go a little bit further on what Bradley said there. Not only is ketamine an option, benzos are an option, haloperidol is an option. How about stepping back and de-escalating with therapeutic communications first? We have all these tools, but sometimes our best tools are not the ones that act on the body. It's just that ability to have a conversation with somebody and de-escalate that situation. Again, I keep going back to the South Carolina case, but one of the very last things was seeking damages and restraining the use of ketamine for law enforcement purposes. This had nothing to do, there's a conversation here that had nothing to do with a medical situation. Now, obviously, we don't have all the facts, so we can't go all the way there. But if there's that question, we have to do that assessment. How do we do that assessment? They're in handcuffs. There's a situation. Let's talk. I mean, obviously, there's an issue. And first, have that conversation. Now, then we get into they're altered and can't make their own decision. And how are we going to get them to a point that we can provide the care that they need? Like you said, if it's true agitated delirium and they're dehydrated because of their hypothermic, and then it is a potential life threat, we need to take care of that. So, but even before that, back up on the conversation. Just have a conversation and say, hey, calm down. We need to help. And nothing happens. But then go through and pick the appropriate tool based on your training and put it to use. Now, utilize, because ketamine is not used 4, 5, 6 times a day on your ambulance. If it is, chances are you're probably not administering it correctly, or you just live in a really bad area. And make sure you know what you're doing. Put the dumb sheets out there. I was one that, on the fire side, we didn't carry a lot of controls. And so when I did get on the ambulance, if I was bringing out the NARC box, and before I opened up and unlocked that NARC box, my protocol manual was open and I saw what I needed to administer. Usually if I had somebody else with me, they calculated with me.
Yeah, I think that's the ideal thing. I'm teach mostly in the clinical environment now. So very rarely are decisions made in a vacuum. And I think what I guess if you had to put in like what kind of sucks about being a paramedic is a lot of times we are on our own. And if we're with an EMT or an AMT, they may not understand the math and pharmacology and stuff. But if you can make it sound like a cockpit in the back of the ambulance where there is some accountability to what you're doing, like, yeah, I know you don't know how to give this drug or whatever, but I want you to know this is what this drug does. I need you to make sure that I'm accountable to doing this. Like I'm saying 0.7 milliliters, and you ought to have them look at it and verify that 0.7 milliliters, or just something simple. It takes a few seconds, but that little simple check is something you can document and ensures you're accountable. So that helps legally too.
Well, you go to the hospital and you have two providers checking off on every medication that you're administering. Or I should say most hospitals, you have two, especially once we get into the pain medications or any of the controls. But even in that case, to assess for allergies, look at the chart, there are two people verifying the medication. And that's something that we can simply do. It's like, hey, this is what I'm calculating. Do you agree? These individuals are trained, and there's no reason as a provider that we don't say, hey, this dosing. A lot of them have gone and utilize your resources, and that just reinforces the training that you have. So,
yeah, and you mentioned question ourselves. I mean, there are 3 principles of a professional caregiver. The first one is we have a duty to question ourselves. Make sure we're doing the right thing. 2, we have the duty to question each other. That way it's a check and balance system. And then we have a duty to accept responsibility for our actions, because if you and I question myself and you question it, and then we proceed with that action, then we've got to accept the responsibility for that action because, of giving that medication. So medication shouldn't be given without that.
Well, we've talked about it here before, and some of the books I've listened to on the road here recently, talking about foreign airlines. At one point in time, the pilot was not to be questioned. And there was actually wrecks that occur or crashes that occurred where they actually have communications between the second, the co-pilot and the navigator. That's like, hey, we're going to crash. But not one of them was willing to say, hey, we're going to crash and we need to do something or take control. And, after those incidences and those references were found on the recording, they came back and said, hey, we need to create a situation where these other people have the authority and the respect to say, hey, I believe we're going to crash. And they all have to make the decision together. When we take a look at, the Boeing 737 MAX 8, they go back to training, they change something and cut corners on training is one of the things that came out. And all of a sudden they had a couple of crashes that took a large amount of life. This is our equivalent there, that we need to make sure that our training is adequate. And then we have our safety systems in place to make sure that people don't get sick or injured. So,
and maybe this is, I know we're probably getting a little bit further into this than we planned on it, but also just during training, we need to be okay with making mistakes. One of the things I've started doing at the hospitals where I teach at is when they start going through a mega code, I don't stop them from making a mistake. I let them make the mistake and let them continue on, and the patient will either get better, deteriorate, whatever. And they'll look up at me like, is this the right dose? I'm like, I don't know. Maybe I have no idea. Just give it if that's what you want to do. And number one, it does hurt them. They realize very quickly they got something wrong. Number two, but they learned a lesson from it. And I feel like in training too often, we're so busy trying to check boxes and just get people through the training that we don't really give them the opportunity to be wrong. And we've done everybody a disservice by training people through the correct action versus training them through the incorrect action. And you can learn in both modalities. So the paramedic who walks in and does a glimmering 100%, does the check off, everything, that's the person that they want to look at and be like, yay, they're awesome. And the one who like kind of fumbles through it, forgets stuff, gets it wrong, but ultimately ends up getting it right, that's the one they think is an idiot. When really it's like, actually they're both equally intelligent. I mean, I feel like the one who bumbled through it but eventually figured it out after they got it wrong, that was probably just their way of getting through it versus bumbling through it, getting it wrong, being like, all right, well, just forget it. We're going to check you off. I'm just saying, like, if we're going to be doing the treatment, if we're going to be doing the training and stuff, I think we need to hold ourselves accountable to getting it wrong too, and being okay with getting it wrong, not just with ketamine, but just with any training that we do. We got to stop eating our own and allow ourselves to be wrong, but being in a position where we can correct ourselves.
Well, I've got two things on that. One, we're inherently designed to learn through failure. So if you take a look at us as infants, right? We start to crawl, we start to walk, and what do? We fall, and we're finding ways not to do something. Whereas if you got somebody that's always got somebody holding them up, they actually take longer to walk on their own. Like, we learn through that process of failure. I take a look at the invention of the light bulb. He's like, I had 100. I didn't fail. I just figured out 100 different ways not to make a light bulb. So we are designed to learn through failure, and I think that is optimum. But I also think, when I take a look, I remember going back through my paramedic program, and ultimately for the first 2 semesters, it didn't matter. Everybody died. You could have the perfect care and they're going to die. And for some reason, they stub their big toe, and next thing you know, they're, and you've created some RNT phenomenon and you're never going to get them back. And it's like, how did this happen? So this is where we got to get varied in that, taking that, that you're talking about, Eric, and putting them in situations that, one, may be completely benign, and let them go and say, hey, by the way, the fact that you just administered ketamine, your patient's now in cardiac arrest, respiratory arrest, and going into cardiac arrest. And let them work through that. It's like, hey, all right. So in our debrief, you now say, hey, ketamine may have been the right route, but if you take a look, the patient was pretty innocuous. There was nothing reported. You just talked your way into it because you thought we were going to put him down they were going to die or escalate. I remember both my ACLS and PALS Megacode. The very first time I did it, the first medication I gave the right dose for the right medication and called it the wrong thing. And I started going, and as I was going to give the next medication, I went back and said, hey, that first medication was the wrong thing. I know I failed. And guess what? I learned from it. Never gave the wrong thing in the field. In fact, it stopped a physician from giving the wrong medication for a patient because of experiences like that. And I think that's where we win, because we, again, are designed to learn through that failure. So, well, we have gone quite a bit about ketamine tonight, getting into not only various cases, but getting into ketamine specifically just in training, but overall our assessment and management of patients that may be candidates for therapeutic doses of ketamine. So before we get out of here tonight, let's go ahead and get our final thoughts. We'll start, since Bradley brought us this topic, we'll give you the chance to give us our first final thought.
So final thought, I'll run back through the training thing again. First thing is review your protocols, make sure all your personnel review the protocols, train everybody. And then once you train everybody, document the completion of that training. And then review the cases as they come up, and then stay vigilant as a field provider. And I can't say that enough, because don't allow yourself to become complacent, because complacency kills.
That says it all right there, but we're going to see what Eric has to add to it.
Similar along the lines, the only thing I would say is don't outsource your competency and skill set. Make sure you own it yourself, and ask the physicians that you work with in the ERA, what kind of patients do you give ketamine to? You might be interested, if you start surveying a bunch of different physicians, what they would say. Now that I work with pediatricians on a regular basis on the side, I've learned that they give different medications and do different things. They could have the exact same patient, but they're going to have a completely different idea of what they want to do for the patient. And it's interesting. So, I mean, yes, obviously go off of your protocol, but, ask them, they've seen it. We can't be an us versus them all the time, where we're paramedics, they don't know our world. Yeah, but we don't know theirs either. And they've been exposed to a lot more. They have a lot more resources. We should use that to our ability.
Absolutely love that. Don't outsource your competency. It's I like that. So, and I'm just going to say something we consistently say, use those good assessment skills. Before we are administering everything, we've got a good assessment. And, there are times where the patient is in need of therapeutics before, but even that, we can do our, lack of a better term right now, our windshield surveys. We walk in, we figure it out just by interacting from point one. So make sure to complete that assessment first. So as we finish up tonight, we want to just reiterate and thank our podcast partner, the Journal of Emergency Medical Services. Make sure to go to the EMS Today podcast, subscribe, rate, and review on Google, Spotify, and Apple. And that's where you will find us typically every week, other than when we take a week off. Also, don't forget to go by our website, emshandoff.com, and find us on our new Facebook group. And then lastly, our most recent addition, we're going to be starting to release our own episodes via audio, and you will be able to find those as well. We're going to start back at episode number 1, which is now posted live, and you can find the EMS Handoff on all of your favorite podcast sources. We are currently on Apple, Google, and Spotify as well, and we are expanding those out as we speak. But now every week we're going to be releasing that original episode outside of the EMS Today podcast as well. So you can go back and find all of our great episodes. So if you're a new follower, those are out there as well. Those Facebook groups are our most active. So make sure and hop on over there. And don't forget to stop by the Pursuit Company and find our EMS Handoff line of merchandise. At thepursuitco.com, you're going to click on shop, and you'll scroll down and you'll find all of our awesome apparel. So for my co-host, Eric McCullough and Bradley Dean, this is David. Take care, stay safe, and always remember the value of your EMS handoff.